Ladies and gentlemen, every empire, no matter how grand, how revolutionary, or how world-altering, rests not on steel, not on algorithms, not on machines or markets, but on something far more fragile, far more invisible, and infinitely more powerful: the human mind and the small constellation of people who sustain it. When we look at the stories of extraordinary individuals who reshape the boundaries of possibility, it's easy to think of them as self-contained forces of nature, singular minds burning at an intensity the rest of us can barely imagine. But if you look deeper, if you look beyond the headlines and the metrics and the Mars rockets and electric revolutions, you'll find something else entirely. You'll find a quiet, hidden ecosystem, a network of emotional, psychological, and neurological support that makes such relentless creation possible. You see, no one can sustain that level of innovation alone. No one can continuously bear the weight of global attention, failure, and ambition without something, or someone, helping regulate the chaos inside the mind. Neuroscience tells us that the human brain is not designed for endless output. It's a system that thrives on cycles of rest, feedback, and connection. We are wired, quite literally, for support. Think about it: the prefrontal cortex, the command center of decision-making and creativity, functions best when emotional stability is maintained. Under chronic stress or social isolation, it begins to short-circuit. Executive function collapses, innovation declines. But introduce trust, empathy, emotional resonance, and suddenly, the brain's capacity expands, dopamine and oxytocin flow, cognitive flexibility increases. We begin to think more clearly, risk more intelligently, and dream more vividly. Behind every great innovator, there exists at least one person, or sometimes several, who serve as an emotional stabilizer. Someone who can absorb the turbulence, redirect it, and return calm. This is not about fame or recognition. It's about emotional symmetry, about balance. You might never see their faces in the news, or their names in the credits, but they're there, anchoring the storm, keeping the human at the center of the machine from fracturing. I've often wondered how many empires have fallen, not because the leader lost vision, but because they lost connection, because the invisible scaffolding, the emotional architecture that held them steady, was weakened, neglected, or misunderstood. Neuroscientifically, that support system functions like an auxiliary nervous system, an external neural network of trust and feedback that helps the mind process complexity without collapsing under it. When someone is pushing the boundaries of human capacity, whether in technology, science, or art, they enter a state that neuroscientists call high cognitive strain. It's a paradoxical space where creativity peaks, but vulnerability also surges. The brain oscillates between euphoria and exhaustion, genius and self-doubt. And it's in that fragile between that a support system becomes indispensable. A grounded partner, a friend, a mentor, someone who reminds the mind of its humanity while it's busy trying to build the future. People often mistake innovation for isolation. They assume the path to brilliance is solitary. But solitude and loneliness are not the same thing. Solitude is the deliberate retreat to recharge creative energy. Loneliness, on the other hand, is a neurochemical famine, an absence of relational feedback that can dismantle focus and drive. When we study the neural signatures of peak performance, one pattern emerges consistently: individuals who sustain greatness over time almost always maintain deep, emotionally nourishing relationships. That's the paradox of high performance. Human greatness requires deep connection. It's not weakness, it's fuel. In fact, recent studies from cognitive neuroscience show that emotional connection literally sharpens executive function. When we feel supported, our amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm center, calms down, allowing the prefrontal cortex to regain control. This isn't sentimentality, it's biology. Connection is the brain's most powerful performance enhancer. Now imagine someone carrying the cognitive load of running multiple world-changing companies at once. Imagine the constant input of data, decisions, and dangers. That mind cannot operate in isolation. It would burn out. It needs a feedback loop, an emotional regulator. a partner or inner circle capable of both grounding and challenging it, of offering honesty without fear and comfort without dependence. What fascinates me as a neuroscientist is how the human mind adapts to massive responsibility. When a person holds the fate of millions in their decisions, the neural architecture itself begins to change. The brain rewires for efficiency, compressing decision loops, pruning emotional distractions, and enhancing pattern recognition. But there's a cost. Empathy often declines, social bandwidth shrinks, and the ability to rest diminishes. The result is an extraordinary mind, highly effective, yet perpetually at risk of emotional implosion. That's where the secret support system steps in. The unseen presence that rehumanizes the leader. Sometimes it's a partner, sometimes it's a small inner circle, sometimes it's an anchor figure from childhood who remains a quiet voice of reason. These individuals act as emotional custodians of genius. Their role isn't to slow it down, but to stabilize it, to make sure the engine doesn't destroy itself while breaking the sound barrier. When I study the psychological patterns of visionary leaders, one theme repeats itself. Those who endure have relationships built on radical honesty. They don't surround themselves with comfort, they surround themselves with clarity. Support doesn't mean protection from pain. It means someone who understands your inner code so deeply that they can reflect truth back to you without distortion. That is emotional technology at its finest, a living mirror capable of recalibrating the psyche. In neuroscience, we call this co-regulation. It's the process by which two nervous systems synchronize. When someone you trust speaks to you in calm, grounded tones, your own heart rate and breathing unconsciously align with theirs. This is not metaphorical, it's measurable. In fact, heart rate variability studies show that high-performing individuals who have emotionally attuned partners or confidence exhibit greater resilience under pressure and faster recovery after stress. Think about what that means. Every great idea, every bold decision, every leap into the unknown quietly carries the fingerprint of that co-regulation. It's not just one mind at work, it's two or more, resonating in unseen harmony. Sometimes the support system is intellectual, someone who challenges assumptions, who forces the innovator to think more deeply. Other times it's emotional, a presence that restores peace, reminding the mind that it's safe to dream. In rare cases, it's both, and that combination becomes an unstoppable force. Ladies and gentlemen, when we look at an empire, we see the towers, the technology, the markets. But we rarely see the emotional architecture holding it together. Empires don't crumble from external attacks. They fracture from within, when the human system that built them collapses under its own emotional weight. Let's pause here for a moment and consider something most people overlook: the rhythm of resilience. Every high-performing individual operates on a hidden pulse, a cycle of expansion and recovery. When that rhythm is disrupted by constant demands, exhaustion becomes the silent enemy. The body might still function, but the mind starts to blur. Creativity fades, patience erodes, empathy vanishes. But when there's someone, some presence, that restores that rhythm, the entire system resets. That is the invisible magic of emotional synchrony. And that's why every empire, no matter how advanced, still depends on something ancient, something primal: human connection. The most sophisticated mind in the world is still a biological system running on emotional energy. Support is not a luxury, it's a neural necessity. When I think about the human architecture of success, I don't see an individual towering above the rest. I see a system, a living network of energies, emotions, and shared resilience. The myth of the lone genius is just that, a myth. Every extraordinary creator has, somewhere in the shadows, a source of grounding that allows their brilliance to shine without disintegrating into chaos. The mind may generate the idea, but the support system sustains the flame. From a neuroscientific lens, this makes perfect sense. The brain's default mode network, the neural circuitry responsible for creativity, imagination, and self-reflection, depends heavily on emotional stability to operate at peak levels. When stress overwhelms the system, the brain's focus narrows to survival, not innovation. That's why emotional safety isn't a soft concept, it's a prerequisite for genius. You cannot dream of the stars if your brain is trapped in fight or flight. Now imagine the psychological terrain of someone constantly balancing impossible deadlines, massive expectations, and public scrutiny. They live in a near constant state of neural arousal. Cortisol spikes, adrenaline surges, sleep diminishes. Over time, this state becomes unsustainable unless there's an external regulator, someone who provides the mind with the permission to pause, to breathe, to simply exist without demand. That is the secret support system, the unseen human infrastructure that turns burnout into balance, chaos into clarity. It might manifest as a late night conversation, a quiet dinner, a hand on the shoulder, or even a moment of shared silence that reminds the brain it's not alone. These moments don't make headlines, but they make history. In the field of effective neuroscience, we've discovered something astonishing. Emotional attunement between two people can enhance neural efficiency. When two brains synchronize through empathy, listening, or shared understanding, they begin to exchange predictive signals, tiny anticipations of one another's thoughts and feelings. This phenomenon, known as inter-brain coherence, allows communication to flow faster than words, creating a kind of neural duet. Now, think of how powerful that is in the context of innovation. Imagine a leader making thousands of micro decisions per day, each one shaping the future of technology or humanity itself. The presence of someone whose nervous system can harmonize with theirs acts as a stabilizing algorithm. It's as though two processors share the computational load. The result: clearer thinking, sharper intuition, faster recovery, deeper empathy. But here's the catch. This kind of support system doesn't just happen. It's built through vulnerability, through radical honesty, through countless moments of choosing connection over ego. The people who sustain great minds are those who dare to speak truth to them, not just comfort them. They know when to challenge, when to listen, and when to step back. That balance requires emotional intelligence of the highest order. I've spent years studying the relationship between genius and emotional grounding, and one truth has emerged consistently. Behind sustained brilliance lies sustained belonging. The sense of being seen not for what one produces, but for who one is. When that foundation erodes, the human system collapses. The mind might keep producing for a while, but the soul begins to fracture. We've seen it across history. Brilliant minds who built empires yet died lonely, misunderstood, or broken. Not because they lacked intellect, but because they lacked emotional architecture. We often underestimate the cost of isolation. Loneliness isn't just an emotional state, it's a biological stressor. It increases inflammation, impairs immunity, and disrupts cognitive function. Chronic loneliness shrinks the hippocampus, the region of the brain responsible for memory and learning. It literally makes us less intelligent over time. That's why every empire built on isolation eventually erodes from the inside out. But when connection is present, something beautiful happens. The brain begins to heal faster, adapt faster, think faster. Relationships become regenerative energy sources. In high-pressure environments, say, leading a mission that could redefine human civilization, the smallest act of empathy becomes a neurological lifeline. It's what allows the brain to keep innovating without self-destructing. I remember reading a fascinating longitudinal study from Stanford that followed top executives, scientists, and creative leaders for over 2 decades. The study found that IQ, education, and work ethic mattered less in predicting long-term success than the presence of one consistent, emotionally stabilizing relationship. Just one. It could be a spouse, a close friend, a mentor, but it was always someone who provided unconditional psychological grounding. Think about that. The foundation of enduring success is not genius, it's trust. Not the trust of millions, but the trust of one. When people talk about leadership, they often focus on strategy, innovation, vision. But real leadership begins with emotional regulation. A leader who cannot regulate their own emotions will eventually destabilize the entire system they've built. And yet, regulation doesn't always come from within. it often comes from without. A quiet conversation at midnight can prevent a collapse at dawn. Let's bring this into sharper focus. In the human brain, there's a delicate interplay between the amygdala, which governs emotion, and the prefrontal cortex, which governs logic. Under stress, the amygdala hijacks the system, flooding the body with cortisol and shutting down rational thought. But when someone we trust speaks to us, calmly, authentically, the prefrontal cortex reactivates. The brain literally returns to coherence through connection. That's why emotional support isn't weakness. It's neural recalibration. The truth is, every empire is a human story before it's an economic one. Before rockets launch, factories hum, or cities light up, there's a moment in the dark when one mind leans on another, when exhaustion meets empathy, when fear meets understanding. That's where true innovation begins, not in the boardroom, but in the bond. I've seen extraordinary leaders confess that their greatest breakthroughs didn't come in moments of triumph, but in moments of collapse, when someone reminded them that they were still human, that they didn't need to be invincible to be visionary. That kind of support doesn't make you weaker, it makes you limitless. Because when the brain no longer wastes energy pretending to be unbreakable, it finally has energy to create. Ladies and gentlemen, behind every empire there is someone, perhaps unseen, perhaps uncredited, who holds the soul of that empire steady. They are the quiet guardians of vision, the emotional engineers of destiny. Their work is invisible, but their impact is immeasurable. And maybe that's the most profound lesson of all. Greatness is not a solo performance, it's a symphony. Genius is not isolation, it's resonance. We talk about building rockets, coding neural networks, colonizing planets. But the greatest technology humanity has ever known is still the human heart. The capacity to connect, to restore, to believe in another person's impossible dream even when the world doesn't. That is the secret energy behind every revolution. So, when we think about the future, about innovation, about leadership, about empire, we should ask not just what is being built, but who is holding the builder. Because behind every dream that changes the world, there's a human connection strong enough to hold the weight of it. And if there's one truth I've learned studying the human brain, it's this: we are not designed to go alone. Even the brightest mind needs an anchor. Even the strongest heart needs a mirror. And even the most relentless visionary needs, somewhere in the quiet, a place where they can finally rest. Because without that, without love, trust, and emotional resonance, there is no empire, no legacy, no lasting light. There's just noise. But with it, even the impossible becomes inevitable. So perhaps the true secret behind every great empire is not what the world sees, but what it never will: the unseen love, the invisible strength, the unspoken support that makes the extraordinary seem almost human. Thank you.